Welcome to another episode of Show and Tell Book Nook. I'm Amber,
And I'm Chantelle.
and today we're talking about The Terminalist by Jack Carr. This was a book recommendation from my husband, and he's read the entire series, or all of the books in the series that have been released so far, and raved about it. And when he first talked to me about it, he's like, Amber, you'll like this novel because you like authors who have recommended this novel.
I also think it's funny because I found this book at a thrift store. And so I texted you and I was like, hey, I got this book. It looks interesting. 2 seconds later, you're like, actually, Levi just told me about this.
Let's talk about the author. So, Jack Carr is a former Navy SEAL who led special operation teams as a team leader, platoon commander, troop commander, and task unit commander. For someone who's not familiar with the military at all, that basically means he was in a position of leadership over highly trained individuals. And that's kind of why he's credible in writing this particular story, because his main character, Lieutenant Commander James Reece, is also a Navy SEAL who's been in those leadership positions.
Starts with Lieutenant Commander Reece. He's on a deployment when something goes wrong. They don't really feel great about it, and his entire team ends up dying except for him. He's injured and he's sent home to the States, but right before he gets sent home, in order to be able to leave, he has to go see medical. And the doctor tells him, hey, there's something funny with some of your MRI scans. It looks like you have a mass in your brain. So check it out when you're in the States. A couple of things happen on base. He ends up going home to find that his wife and daughter have been murdered by a gang. So he starts digging into what's going on, finds out that he and his entire team all had the exact same tumor in the same location in their brains. And so he uncovers a plot from the highest levels of government and even in the military that tested on him and his unit without their consent and without their knowledge. And it obviously didn't go well because I got tumors. And so now they're trying to cover up that whole thing. And so it's him systematically trying to figure out who it is and then going after them to make things right.
I thought it was very interesting that Jack Carr chose to write a character who is extremely well trained and competent and capable and take literally everything away from him. And that leads to this amoral behavior resulting in seeking revenge and creating the list of people he's going after for vengeance. And in the process, he brings along people he's connected to. And it was kind of interesting to see the reactions that all of them had as he explained what happened and how he ended up where he is in that moment.
Which leads us right into, so we're going to kind of talk about 3 things we liked and 3 things we didn't. And then give you guys kind of some similar book suggestions based off of if you like this style of book. But I really liked the characters that Carr brought in to kind of help fluff this up a little bit more and not just make it so intense on his main character, because the other characters throughout the novel really help add to it and add extra layers of empathy or sensitivity or also just some well-roundedness. And I really appreciated that he did that and didn't just have it as Reece's point of view, his one driven mission. Like there was other stuff also being involved.
This might be a little controversial, but I actually really liked the detail he went into on the military side of things. So talking about the different operations that Reece had been involved in, the equipment, and kind of like the reasoning behind tactics. I especially liked Reece's view on leadership. He was very focused on leading from the front, meaning if his unit's doing really well, then passing that praise on to his subordinates, saying, oh, they're the reason for the success. If his team was not doing well, if there was a failure, owning that failure and saying, I was the weak point, it was my fault.
The other thing I really liked about this book is the point of views. So it's not told in first person, it's told in third. And it's not always from Reese's point of view. There are chapters where it's from the politicians or from the accountants or all of the bad guys, the corrupt individuals who set about this whole chain of events. So I thought that was kind of clever way to bring it to like a more 3D perspective.
I do want to bring up one of my biggest complaints, and that is Carr's description of individuals. And I'm going to say this probably more harshly than it needs to be said, but I felt like it was extremely sexist, and I don't know the right word for it, but essentially all of the women except for the bad one, the evil one, were described as extremely attractive. The evil person was described as ugly, like physical characteristics matched the overall characterization, right? His use of descriptive language specifically towards physical characterization did that, and I was not a fan.
You said he liked it. I think he overdid it slightly, the amount of detail that he put into it. I think you're right. I love learning actually the history about similar battles that happened that led to XYZ, and that's why they have this policy in place. Like aspects of that I thought were really cool. But I felt like this novel was written for someone who has a really good knowledge of military.
Yeah. So this was something Levi and I talked about a little bit, and I was like, it's very descriptive about guns, cars. And he's like, well, Amber, who's the target audience? Like, those are the things that the target audience cares about, right? Like, you're the target audience for romance and young adult novels to some degree. Take into consideration the target audience this book was written for. I think there is a very real element in this novel of this could actually take place, right? Like, we know that there is a huge market for drug testing, and like the drug that was tested on his unit was to try to prevent PTSD, which troops all over the world deal with because of the nature of warfare today, right? So there is a market to develop things to prevent PTSD in the military. So it's believable that a drug trial would exist for something, right? It's believable that it would be tested on the military without their knowledge because that has happened in the past. And there are just a lot of other elements where you're like, oh, that's realistic, that could happen. But then he took it a step too far in other places, and that was my big complaint. I'm like, if you're going to be so realistic about some of these details, having the SEALs involved on an operation on our soil, which is in direct violation of law, I was like, why? The climax of the story felt too reminiscent to Tom Clancy writing for me. And I don't want to do spoilers, but there is a scene in Patriot Games that felt similar. It's not the exact same, but it felt similar to the climaxing action in Terminal List. So for me, reading that kind of was a throw off of like, oh, for whatever reason, it just didn't give me the right vibes. And then to have the characters that were involved in that scene act the way that they acted furthered my dissatisfaction with the ending. Even before it was like sail off into the sunset for a setup for a second book, just I would say the last chapter and the epilogue, I guess, were extremely unsatisfactory for me because it felt like rushed. I need to end this and wrap it up. It wasn't as expertly done as I was expecting based off of what I had heard and the way others had talked about the book.
While I was reading it, I found echoes, I guess, of a lot of different aspects of a bunch of different books. So, what are some of the books you think if you liked Terminal List, you should read these, or vice versa.
So I'm going to start off with, if you haven't read Jack Ryan's Universe by Tom Clancy, start there. It's a classic for this type of thriller suspense writing. And I would go as far as saying that Tom Clancy was the originator of this specific genre. I would say my complaints about Terminal List are the same complaints I have about Tom Clancy. If you enjoyed Terminal List, I believe you will very much enjoy Tom Clancy's writing. And on top of that, I would recommend Brad Thor. Brad Thor is a super well-known, respected author in this particular genre, and I believe he read Jack Carr's manuscript and helped him find his editor and publisher.
I think realism-wise, like, this reminded me of the Dan Brown books, which I think aged better than a lot of these political thrillers, just by nature of what they're written about. But if you like the feeling of this could actually be happening, I think Dan Brown does an excellent job with a lot of his novels, specifically like the Robert Langdon series. I also, while we were talking, and you're talking about how you really liked his leadership style, it reminded me of Red Rising. And specifically like the leadership that the main character in that series displays. I think those two, while Red Rising is more sci-fi, if you like that aspect of Terminal List, we would highly recommend Red Rising.
And then the last one I would add would be Lee Child's Jack Reacher series, which I've watched on Amazon. I have not read yet, but my husband really likes these books. They're more of a murder thriller than a political military thriller. However, Jack Reacher is a similar character to James Reece. Thank you again for joining this episode of Show and Tell Book Nook. As always, if you have recommendations for books, please let us know. If there's some book that you love in this genre, please drop it in the comments, because I actually do love reading the political thriller or the military thriller. I just don't do it as often. So always looking for recommendations. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys. Bye.